I knew something was wrong the second I heard the nail gun. Not because construction noise was unusual in our neighborhood, but because it was coming from a spot where absolutely nobody should have been building anything. By Friday afternoon, my neighbor had attached part of a brand new deck directly to my house, and somehow he acted like I was the unreasonable one for noticing. Looking back now, that week taught me something I've never forgotten. Some people don't get serious about boundaries until a government inspector starts carrying a clipboard toward their property. At the time, I was living in a quiet townhouse community just outside a small city in Ohio. Nothing fancy, just one of those neighborhoods where everybody waved when they pulled into the driveway. Everybody knew which dog belonged to which family, and most disputes got solved with a 5-minute conversation over a fence. I'd been there almost 8 years. My place wasn't huge, but I loved it. I'd spent years fixing things up, planting shrubs, repainting trim, replacing old windows. All those little homeowner projects that slowly turn a house into something that feels like part of your identity. My neighbor, on the other hand, was a guy named Trent Maddox. Now, when Trent first moved in, I actually liked him. He was friendly enough, always had a joke ready, always seemed willing to lend a ladder or help carry something heavy. But over time, I started noticing a pattern. Trent had this habit of treating rules like suggestions. Parking restrictions, trash pickup schedules, HOA guidelines, noise ordinances, none of them seemed to apply to him. If somebody challenged him, he'd laugh and say something like, "Relax, nobody cares." The problem was that eventually somebody always cared. Our houses sat extremely close together. Between them was a narrow side yard, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk through comfortably. My exterior wall ran almost directly along the property line. It had been that way since the homes were built. Because of that setup, there wasn't much room for major construction projects. Which is why I was surprised when a flatbed truck unloaded a mountain of lumber into Trent's driveway on a Tuesday morning. At first I figured he was replacing a few steps or building a small patio. Nothing unusual there. Then I came home from work that evening and saw concrete forms set up along the side of his house. Wednesday, there were holes in the ground. Thursday, there were posts. By Friday morning, a large elevated deck was taking shape. And that's when I started feeling that little knot in my stomach. Something wasn't adding up. I kept looking for a permit notice posted somewhere. Nothing. No county paperwork. No inspection tag. No contractor signs. Just Trent and 2 buddies working like they were racing a deadline. That afternoon, I walked outside with a cup of coffee and decided to get a closer look. The moment I stepped into the side yard, I stopped. For a second, I honestly thought I was seeing it wrong. I leaned closer. Then I looked again. Nope. I wasn't imagining it. The main support board for his deck was bolted directly into my house. Not near my house. Not beside my house. Into my house. Large lag bolts had been driven through my siding to anchor the deck structure. I remember standing there staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe he thought that wall was shared somehow. Then I noticed fresh wood shavings on the ground beneath the bolts and realized exactly what had happened. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't think it mattered. I found Trent standing on the partially finished deck, holding a drill. "Hey, Trent," I called out. He looked over. "What's up?" I pointed at the wall. "Why is your deck attached to my house?" He actually laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not embarrassed laughter. Just a casual little chuckle like I'd asked him why the sky was blue. "Oh, that," he said. "That's how these things are built." I stared at him. "Using my wall?" He shrugged. "It'll be fine." I set my coffee down. "Did you ask me first?" "No." "Did you pull a permit?" Another shrug. "It's just a deck." I could already feel my patience starting to disappear. "You drilled into my siding." "It's a couple bolts." "You attached a structure to my property." "Come on, man," he said. "Nobody around here pulls permits for decks." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Not that he made a mistake. Not that he misunderstood. He knew exactly what he was doing. He simply believed nobody would stop him. For a few seconds, I considered arguing. I considered explaining property rights, liability issues, insurance risks, and everything else that comes with attaching a structure to someone else's home. But then I looked at his face. He wasn't listening. He'd already decided he was right. The conversation was just a formality he wanted to get through so he could get back to building. I remember picking up my coffee and taking a slow breath. "Trent," I said calmly, "you need to stop work until this gets sorted out." He smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people wear when they think they've already won. "Not happening." Then he turned around and went back to drilling. The sound of that drill echoed through the side yard while I stood there watching. And that little shrug he gave me. Honestly, that's the moment everything changed. Because up until then, I was still trying to be a neighbor. The second he dismissed me like that, I stopped thinking like a neighbor. And I started thinking like a homeowner whose property had just been used without permission. The next morning, before Trent even picked up a hammer, I made a phone call that would end up costing him far more than he ever imagined. The next morning, before Trent even picked up a hammer, I made a phone call that would end up costing him far more than he ever imagined. I wasn't angry when I made it, at least not the kind of angry people picture. Honestly, I was disappointed more than anything. I'd spent years living next to this guy. We'd shared conversations in our driveways, borrowed tools from each other, talked about football, complained about property taxes. I kept thinking how easy this could have been. One conversation, one simple request, one sentence. Hey, do you mind if I attach something to your wall? Instead, he skipped all of that and acted like my property belonged to him. So I called the county building department and explained exactly what was happening. The woman who answered asked a few questions. Was the structure attached to my home? Yes. Had I given permission? No. Was there a permit posted? Not that I could see. She thanked me, took down the address, and said an inspector would review the complaint. The entire call lasted maybe 6 minutes. After I hung up, I figured it might take weeks. Government offices aren't exactly famous for moving quickly, so I went on with my life. What I didn't know was that attaching an unpermitted structure to somebody else's home tends to get attention a lot faster than a typical complaint. For days later, I came home from work and saw a white county truck parked in front of Trent's house. I actually laughed when I saw it. Not because I was happy he was in trouble, but because the timing felt almost cinematic. The deck was nearly finished. Railings were up. Stairs were installed. Patio furniture had already been delivered. He was so close to enjoying the thing that he probably thought he was in the clear. Then reality pulled into the driveway. The inspector was a guy named Mr. Holloway, probably late 50s, gray hair, calm demeanor, the kind of person who looked impossible to rattle. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't aggressive. He simply walked around with a clipboard and measured things. Somehow that made him even scarier. I watched from my kitchen window while he examined the deck. First he measured the setback. Then he looked underneath. Then he crouched near the footings. Then he walked directly into the narrow side yard between our homes. I couldn't hear every word, but I could hear enough. Who approved this attachment? He asked. Silence. Do you have permit documentation? More silence. Then came the moment I still remember. Mr. Holloway placed his hand on the ledger board that was bolted into my wall. He followed the bolts with his eyes, looked at the siding, looked back at Trent, and removed his glasses. Anybody who's ever dealt with authority figures knows that moment. It's the moment before bad news arrives. 20 minutes later, a bright orange notice appeared on the deck. Work stopped immediately. The following week, the official report arrived. I got a copy because my property was involved. Reading it felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I had expected maybe one violation. Maybe two. There were six. 6 separate code failures. No building permit. Improper attachment to an adjacent structure. Inadequate footing depth. Missing joist hardware. Missing flashing protection. Setback encroachment. Every single category created its own problem. Together, they created a disaster. The attachment issue alone was enough to prevent approval. The setback violation meant the deck extended too close to the property line. The footing depth didn't meet frost requirements. Missing flashing created moisture risks against the building envelope. It was one of those situations where the deeper inspectors looked, the worse things became. I saw Trent outside that evening pacing his driveway with paperwork in his hands. For the first time since construction started, he didn't look confident. He looked nervous. The following day, he knocked on my door. That was new. I opened it and found him standing there holding a folder. Hey, he said awkwardly. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I almost laughed. We got off on the wrong foot when you drilled into my house. But I let him talk. He explained that the county was overreacting. He said inspectors always exaggerated violations. He said the deck was safe. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Would you be willing to sign something saying you don't have a problem with the attachment? There it was. Suddenly, my opinion mattered. Suddenly, he wanted cooperation. I looked at him for a few seconds. Did you care whether I had a problem before you drilled into my wall? His expression tightened. That's not the point. Actually, I said, That's exactly the point. He left frustrated. Over the next 2 weeks, things got worse for him. He hired a contractor hoping portions of the deck could be salvaged. The contractor spent an afternoon inspecting everything and eventually delivered news Trent clearly didn't want to hear. The structure had been designed around a series of shortcuts. Fixing one issue wouldn't solve the others. To bring the deck into compliance would require major reconstruction. Then came the permit review fees. Then engineering consultations. Then documentation costs. Every attempt to save the project generated another bill. One evening I was mowing my lawn when another neighbor, Linda, walked over. "You hear what's happening next door?" she asked. "A little." She shook her head. "Apparently he's already spent thousands trying to keep that deck." I remember looking toward Trent's house. Part of me genuinely felt bad. Nobody likes seeing money disappear. Nobody enjoys watching a neighbor struggle. But every time sympathy started creeping in, I remembered those bolts in my wall and that dismissive shrug. Actions have costs. Sometimes those costs arrive later than expected. By the end of the second week, the county's position became crystal clear. The deck could not remain. Not modified. Not partially repaired. Not grandfathered in. Removed. Completely. I don't think Trent believed it until the demolition order arrived. Even then, he spent several days calling offices and arguing. At one point, I overheard him telling somebody on speakerphone that the county was targeting him unfairly. That seemed to be his explanation for everything. Nothing was ever his fault. Rules were unfair. Neighbors were difficult. Inspectors were unreasonable. Somehow, everyone else created the problem except the guy who built a deck into someone else's house. Then demolition day arrived. Early Thursday morning, 2 trucks pulled into his driveway. A crew stepped out carrying pry bars, saws, and tool bags. The same structure that had taken days to build started coming apart piece by piece. I watched from my back patio while workers removed railings, pulled deck boards, detached beams, and dismantled stairs. The process was strangely quiet compared to the construction. There was no excitement, no pride, no celebration, just the sound of consequences being loaded into a dumpster. Around lunchtime, one of the workers began removing the ledger board from my wall. That's when the full damage became visible. 11 bolt holes. 11. Each one represented a moment when someone decided my property rights didn't matter. The county required those repairs to be completed properly at Trent's expense. Waterproofing, patching, siding replacement were necessary, inspection approval. Everything documented. Everything paid for. By noon, the giant deck that had dominated the side yard was gone. All that remained was a pile of lumber stacked beside the driveway, and a very expensive lesson sitting in the middle of it. By noon, the giant deck that had dominated the side yard was gone. All that remained was a pile of lumber stacked beside the driveway, and a very expensive lesson sitting in the middle of it. I stood in my kitchen for a while looking out the window, almost expecting the structure to still be there. It had become such a huge part of daily life over those few weeks that seeing empty space felt strange. The side yard looked the way it always had before all this started, except now there were fresh patches of disturbed soil, scattered sawdust, and a silence that somehow said more than all the arguments that came before it. Later that afternoon, I walked outside to check the repairs being done on my wall. One of the contractors was sealing the last of the bolt holes while another replaced damaged siding panels. As I watched them work, I found myself thinking about how differently the entire story could have ended. If Trent had knocked on my door that first day, if he had simply treated me like a neighbor instead of an obstacle, there's a good chance none of this would have happened. Maybe we still would have disagreed. Maybe I still would have told him he needed permits and approvals. But at least there would have been a conversation. There would have been respect. Instead, he chose assumption over communication, confidence over common sense, and shortcuts over responsibility. A few days later, I ran into him for the first time since demolition. We both happened to be checking our mail. For a second, neither of us said anything. The tension wasn't angry anymore. It was something else. Embarrassment, maybe. Regret. Exhaustion. Finally, he looked at me and shook his head. "Cost me a fortune," he muttered. I nodded. I imagine it did. He stared down the street for a moment before speaking again. I really thought nobody would care. That sentence stuck with me, not because it was surprising, but because it was honest. For the first time since this whole thing started, he wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming inspectors. He wasn't blaming county rules. He wasn't blaming me. He was admitting what had really happened. He assumed the rules wouldn't matter. He assumed property lines were flexible. He assumed nobody would challenge him. And most importantly, he assumed there would never be consequences. The funny thing is, the county didn't tear down that deck because they were angry. They didn't do it to make an example out of him. They did it because building codes exist for reasons most people never think about until something goes wrong. Safety, liability, property rights, water intrusion, structural failure. All those boring details people ignore when everything seems fine. The deck came down because it never should have been built that way in the first place. A few months later, life in the neighborhood returned to normal. Kids rode bikes through the streets. People walked dogs after dinner. Lawns got mowed on weekends. The giant deck became one of those local stories everybody remembered. Every neighborhood has one. The story people tell new homeowners years later. You see that side yard over there? Let me tell you what happened. Even now, when I think back on it, I don't remember the demolition as much as I remember that shrug. That casual little shrug when I pointed out he had drilled into my house. Because in many ways, that was the real mistake. Not the missing permit. Not the bad footing depth. Not the setback violation. The real mistake was believing somebody else's property didn't deserve respect. Everything that happened afterward was just the bill coming due. And that's why I've always been curious how other people see situations like this. If you found out your neighbor had attached a structure directly to your home without permission, would you have called the county inspector immediately, or would you have given them one final chance to remove it themselves? Was I too quick to involve the authorities, or was that exactly the right response after being ignored? Let me know what you honestly think down in the comments. I read every perspective, especially when people disagree. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor dispute, a property line battle, or a situation where somebody thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more real stories about neighbors, property rights, and the moments when ordinary people discover that actions really do have consequences.